At exactly 4:11 in the morning, the billionaire heard something that should not have been possible inside a mansion protected by private security, coded doors, and cameras covering every hallway. A child was singing in his kitchen. Not loudly, not happily, softly, like someone trying not to wake the house. Ethan Walker had spent years living inside silence so complete that even footsteps echoed differently after midnight. But this sound drifted carefully beneath his office door upstairs while rain pressed against the mansion windows outside. At first he thought he imagined it. Then he heard metal clink softly against marble, a cabinet door closing, tiny footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Ethan stood slowly from his desk and followed the sound downstairs, one hand still resting against the half-finished whiskey beside his computer. He had not slept properly in years anyway. The Walker estate looked almost ghost-like before sunrise. Long dark hallways, cold golden lamps glowing against polished walls, paintings staring down over empty corridors. Yet as Ethan approached the kitchen, something strange happened. He smelled vanilla. When he finally pushed the kitchen door open, he stopped breathing for a second. Standing on top of a wooden stool much too tall for her tiny body was the maid's 3-year-old daughter. Flour covered nearly every surface in sight. One mixing bowl had tipped completely sideways near the sink. Eggshells littered the marble counter beside an open bag of sugar. There was more shell than yolk inside the bowl. Melted butter slowly dripped toward the edge of the counter. And in the center of all that disaster stood little Ava Monroe wearing pink pajamas dusted white with flour while carefully stirring cake batter with both hands like the entire world depended on it. She did not notice Ethan at first. She kept whispering instructions to herself exactly the way children repeat things adults once taught them. Tiny bit more sugar, stir slower, don't burn it again. Then Ethan saw the old recipe card lying beside the bowl. His stomach tightened instantly. Blue handwriting, butter stains near the corners, folded edges softened by time. The recipe belonged to Emily. For 8 years, nobody inside the Walker estate had spoken Emily Walker's name comfortably. Employees avoided it. Friends changed subjects. Reporters referred to her only during anniversary articles about Ethan's business empire and personal tragedy. Emily died at 6 years old during a rainstorm outside Boston when a truck crossed the center lane too fast on wet pavement. Ethan survived the crash. Emily did not. After the funeral, he erased birthdays from the mansion entirely. No celebrations, no candles, no music drifting from kitchens late at night. The house slowly became quieter every year afterward until it barely felt lived in anymore. Staff members performed their jobs carefully and left conversations unfinished whenever Ethan entered rooms. But 14 months earlier, Claire Monroe arrived through a staffing agency carrying her sleepy daughter against one shoulder before dawn shifts. Claire worked harder than anyone in the mansion. She polished rooms nobody entered, reorganized shelves nobody noticed, fixed details before problems appeared, and somewhere along the way, little Ava quietly filled the empty spaces inside the estate without permission. Ava left crayon drawings near the greenhouse for gardeners to discover. She greeted security guards by name. Once she placed tiny flowers beside the piano because she said the room looked lonely. Ethan barely paid attention at first. His life existed inside airports, boardrooms, and endless meetings. But children change the atmosphere of places simply by existing inside them. Staff members smiled more often. The kitchen baked pastries again on Sundays. Mrs. Harper, the elderly head housekeeper, even convinced the staff to decorate small corners of the mansion during Christmas, though Ethan never acknowledged them. Ava somehow brought warmth into rooms people stopped emotionally entering years ago. And now before sunrise, she stood inside Ethan Walker's forbidden kitchen trying to bake him a birthday cake using Emily's recipe card. The floor creaked beneath Ethan's shoe. Ava spun around so quickly the wooden spoon slipped from her hands and clattered loudly against the marble. Fear flashed across her tiny face immediately. She looked at the flour, the broken eggs, the mess everywhere. Her lower lip trembled slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was trying to make it pretty." Ethan could not answer right away because his eyes remained fixed on the faded photograph beside the recipe card. Emily stood smiling in the picture wearing a chef's hat far too large for her little head. Ethan remembered that exact afternoon. She spilled frosting across the counters and laughed so hard she nearly fell off the stool into his arms. He had buried that memory for years beneath work and exhaustion because remembering hurt too much. Yet here it was again, standing under warm kitchen lights before dawn beside another little girl covered in flour. "How did you get that picture?" Ethan finally asked quietly. Ava lowered her eyes toward the floor. "I found it inside a library book upstairs." Ethan's chest tightened painfully. "Why did you bring it down here?" Ava answered with heartbreaking honesty only children possess. "Because the girl looked lonely." The words hit harder than grief itself. Not gone, not dead. Lonely. Ethan suddenly realized nobody inside this mansion had allowed Emily to feel alive anymore. Her memory became something locked away carefully like fragile glass nobody dared touch. But Ava looked at that photograph and saw a child who simply needed company. Ethan slowly sat at the kitchen table without speaking while Ava climbed carefully down from the stool. "I didn't mean to make a mess," she whispered again. Ethan looked around the ruined kitchen. Flour handprints across dark marble. One cracked egg dripping near the sink. Sprinkles scattered everywhere except where they belonged. And somehow it was the warmest the mansion had felt in nearly a decade. Ava glanced nervously toward the oven every few seconds while Ethan remained seated beside the kitchen island staring at Emily's old recipe card. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the estate gardens outside. The entire mansion still slept. Somewhere upstairs, an antique grandfather clock echoed faintly through empty hallways while heating vents hummed quietly behind the walls. Ethan had spent years convincing himself silence protected him. Silence meant control. Silence kept memories buried beneath routines and business schedules. Yet tonight the kitchen smelled like vanilla and burnt sugar again, and suddenly the silence no longer felt safe. Ava climbed back onto the stool and opened the oven door too early. Warm air rushed outward carrying the scent of overcooked batter. Inside sat a crooked little cake collapsing slowly on one side. Ava's shoulders dropped immediately. "It broke," she whispered sadly. Ethan walked closer almost without realizing it. Up close the cake looked terrible. Frosting melted unevenly down the edges. One side sank lower than the other. Rainbow sprinkles covered the counter instead of the dessert. Tiny fingerprints pressed accidentally into the icing where Ava clearly tried fixing mistakes herself. Yet the sight pulled Ethan backward through years he spent desperately trying not to remember. Emily's birthday cakes always looked exactly like this. Messy. Uneven. Covered in too many decorations. Once Emily accidentally used salt instead of sugar and cried so hard Ethan ordered pizza afterward just to make her laugh again. He remembered powdered sugar in her curls, tiny socks sliding across marble floors. Her insisting candles mattered more than flavor because birthdays were supposed to sparkle. Ethan swallowed hard as memories returned sharper than they had in years. Ava looked devastated beside the counter. "Birthdays are supposed to look prettier." Ethan surprised himself by answering softly, "The best ones usually don't." Ava blinked up at him carefully as if trying to decide whether adults could suddenly become honest without warning. Then she pointed toward the photograph beside the recipe card. "Was she your daughter?" Ethan nodded once. Ava lowered her voice instinctively. "She looks kind." Ethan stared at Emily's smiling face frozen forever at 6 years old beneath the oversized chef hat. "She was," he answered quietly. Ava thought for several seconds before adding, "Maybe she wanted me to find the recipe." Ethan almost told her life did not work that way. But grief changes people strangely. After enough loss, impossible things stop sounding entirely impossible. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the marble counters, while Ava carefully reached for a packet of birthday candles hidden near the stove. "Which color did she like best?" she asked. Ethan froze slightly because nobody had asked him ordinary questions about Emily in years. People treated her memory carefully like stepping around broken glass. He looked down into the box. Blue, yellow, pink, green. Emily always loved purple, but there were no purple candles left. Ava held up a blue one proudly. Blue can still feel happy. Ethan laughed quietly before he could stop himself. The sound startled both of them. Ava smiled, instantly hearing it. Somewhere inside the mansion, warmth returned to a room that had spent years emotionally abandoned. Claire Monroe woke suddenly to an empty bed beside her. For one terrible second, panic seized her chest so violently she forgot where she was. Then she spotted the staff quarters door slightly open and heard distant voices somewhere upstairs. Claire hurried through the hallway, still wearing yesterday's sweatshirt, exhaustion clouding her thoughts while fear moved faster than reason. Ava had never wandered this far alone before. By the time Claire reached the kitchen entrance, her heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. Then she saw the disaster: flour across marble counters, open cabinets, melted butter near the stove, and Ethan Walker standing beside her daughter beneath the warm kitchen lights before sunrise. Claire immediately felt sick. "Mr. Walker, I am so sorry," she rushed out before fully entering the room. "I woke up and she was gone, and I promise I'll clean everything." But her voice slowed after noticing Ethan's expression. He did not look angry, confused maybe, emotional certainly, but not furious. Ava quickly grabbed Claire's sleeve. "Mommy," the cake fell down a little. Claire stared at the ruined dessert sitting crookedly beside the extinguished candle. "Ava, sweetheart, you cannot sneak into someone's kitchen at 4 in the morning." "I was fixing his birthday," Ava answered softly. Claire closed her eyes briefly in embarrassment. She had warned Ava earlier that week not to mention Ethan's birthday at all. Staff members knew the rule. The mansion did not celebrate October 17th anymore. "But he looked lonely," Ava added quietly. The room fell still. Claire looked horrified hearing those words aloud. Yet Ethan simply lowered his eyes toward the half-collapsed cake again. Something about the little girl's honesty cut through defenses adults tiptoed around carefully for years. Claire noticed the old photograph beside the recipe card and immediately understood why Ethan seemed different tonight. Emily Walker's picture had not appeared anywhere inside the mansion since Claire started working there. Mrs. Harper once explained softly that Ethan packed every photograph away after the funeral because seeing them became unbearable. Yet now one sat openly beside a ruined birthday cake while dawn slowly brightened the kitchen windows. Ava climbed onto a chair again and pointed proudly toward the candle. "He made a wish already." Claire looked confused. "You lit candles," Ethan answered before Ava could. "Just one." Claire studied him carefully then. Newspapers described Ethan Walker as emotionally unreachable. Staff members called him polite but distant. Investors respected him because nothing ever rattled him publicly. Yet standing beneath the kitchen lights beside Ava's crooked little cake, Ethan looked less like a billionaire and more like a father carrying exhaustion too heavy to hide anymore. Ava disappeared briefly into the pantry before returning with two mismatched dessert forks clutched carefully in both hands. "You still have to eat cake," she informed Ethan seriously. Claire tried stopping her. "Honey, I think Mr. Walker has had enough excitement tonight." But Ava shook her head stubbornly. "Birthday rules." Ethan stared down at the little girl standing beside the ruined cake while memories returned faster now. Emily used to invent rules for everything. Pancake rules, snow day rules, movie night rules. Tiny laws children create because they believe happiness should follow structure adults can trust. Ava handed Ethan one of the forks. Her tiny fingers still carried streaks of blue frosting near the nails. Ethan cut into the cake slowly. Warm batter collapsed across the plate, immediately revealing the center was barely cooked. Ava's face filled with disappointment. "It's ruined." Ethan tasted it anyway. Far too sweet, slightly burnt, crunching eggshell hidden inside frosting. And somehow the flavor nearly destroyed him emotionally because it tasted exactly like Emily's baking. Claire watched his expression change, while silence settled carefully through the kitchen again. "Is it awful?" Ava asked quietly. Ethan swallowed before answering. "It tastes exactly like a birthday cake should." Ava's entire face lit up with joy so pure it changed the room instantly. Claire covered her mouth briefly, trying not to smile herself. Then Ava asked the question nobody inside the Walker estate had spoken aloud in years. "What was her name?" Claire whispered immediately. "Ava," but Ethan kept staring at the faded photograph beside the recipe card. For years, people referred to Emily indirectly because speaking her name felt dangerous around him. "Your daughter, the accident. What happened?" But children believe names deserve to stay alive. "Emily," Ethan answered finally. Ava smiled softly. "That's beautiful. No pity. No awkwardness. Just honesty." Something inside Ethan cracked open, hearing Emily's name spoken naturally again. Morning light slowly spilled across the kitchen windows, turning the marble counters pale gold. Outside, gardeners would arrive soon. Coffee machines downstairs would begin humming awake. The estate would return to routine. Yet inside, the kitchen time seemed suspended completely. Ava climbed back onto the stool beside the counter, while Ethan remained seated nearby, holding the old recipe card carefully between his fingers. Claire quietly began wiping flour from the counters, though much slower now. The panic from earlier had faded into something gentler, something uncertain but warm. Ava pointed toward Emily's photograph again. "I think she would have liked my cake even if it leaned sideways." Ethan looked at the picture for a long moment before nodding softly. "She would have loved it." Ava smiled proudly, hearing that. Then she asked another question adults would never dare ask directly. "Do you still miss her every day?" Claire stopped wiping the counter immediately. Ethan stared out toward the rain-soaked gardens beyond the windows while dawn continued brightening the estate grounds. Finally, he answered honestly, "Every single day." Ava nodded thoughtfully, as if grief made complete sense to her. Then she climbed carefully down from the stool and walked toward Ethan, carrying the drawing she made earlier. 3 figures beside a birthday cake beneath a bright yellow sun. "Your family doesn't have to disappear," she whispered again. The sentence settled deep inside Ethan's chest. Because somewhere over the years, he stopped living beside Emily's memory and started hiding from it instead. He erased birthdays, packed away photographs, filled every empty hour with meetings and business deals because silence hurt less than remembering joy. Yet tonight, a 3-year-old little girl walked barefoot into his kitchen, carrying kindness stronger than fear, and somehow she reached places expensive therapists and grieving years never could. Claire finally looked toward Ethan carefully. "I should take her downstairs before daycare." But before she could move, Ethan surprised both of them. "Would you both stay for breakfast?" The room became still. Claire blinked in disbelief. Ava gasped happily before throwing her tiny arms into the air. Ethan almost looked surprised, hearing his own words aloud. Because for the first time in 8 years, the Walker mansion no longer felt like a monument to grief. It felt like a home trying to wake up again. Ethan stood near the counter while Ava carefully pushed the crooked cake pan farther away from the oven heat, using both tiny hands. The little girl looked completely serious doing it, her eyebrows pressed together with concentration while powdered sugar clung to the front of her pajamas. One of her socks had become damp from stepping into spilled milk near the refrigerator earlier. The kitchen smelled like burnt vanilla, melted butter, and something softer underneath it all that Ethan had not smelled in years. Warmth. Real warmth. Not the expensive artificial fragrance pumped through mansion vents during holidays for guests. This felt lived in, human, imperfect. Ava suddenly looked up at him again. "Do rich people still get birthday wishes?" The question caught Ethan off guard. "Why wouldn't they?" Ava shrugged slightly while scraping frosting off the counter with one finger. "Because rich people already have everything." Ethan stared at her for several seconds before quietly answering, "No, they don't." The little girl nodded as if that confirmed something she already suspected. Then she carefully licked frosting from her finger and pointed toward the faded recipe card again. "Emily wrote messy." Ethan glanced down at the uneven blue handwriting. She had written vanilla with one L and crossed out mix fastly 3 different times. He remembered sitting beside her at this same kitchen island correcting spelling homework while she insisted dictionaries were too bossy. The memory arrived so clearly Ethan had to grip the edge of the counter. For years his grief came in sharp waves that nearly drowned him. Then eventually it changed into something quieter but heavier, like carrying stones inside his chest every waking hour. People assumed time healed tragedy because the crying stopped becoming visible. But time mostly teaches people how to function around emptiness without collapsing publicly. Ethan mastered that skill better than anyone. He built larger companies, bought another estate in Colorado, expanded his investment empire overseas. Magazine covers praised his discipline after personal loss. Yet every October 17th, he locked himself inside this mansion and drank alone until sunrise because the silence felt safer than remembering Emily's laugh. Ava climbed onto the chair near him and leaned over the counter trying to reach the box of sprinkles again. "Can I ask something?" she whispered carefully. Ethan nodded slowly. Did Emily stop having birthdays because she went to heaven? The kitchen became painfully still after that question. Children always spoke about death differently than adults. No rehearsed sympathy, no awkward avoidance, just direct honesty wrapped in innocence. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the extinguished blue candle still leaning sideways inside the frosting. "Yeah," he answered softly. Ava considered that quietly. "Then maybe she wanted you to still have yours." The sentence settled heavily between them, because Ethan had never once considered the possibility that refusing happiness might also dishonor the child he missed. Ava suddenly gasped softly and pointed toward the oven again. "The bottom's burning." Ethan moved quickly beside her and pulled the cake pan completely free before smoke could spread farther through the kitchen. The underside had darkened almost black near one corner. Ava looked devastated all over again. "I ruin everything when I try helping." Ethan turned toward her immediately. "No, you don't." His voice came out firmer than intended. Ava blinked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Ethan set the pan down carefully before continuing quieter this time. "You made this kitchen feel alive again tonight." The little girl stared at him like she did not fully understand the meaning of those words, only the gentleness behind them. Outside the windows, rain continued sliding down the glass in silver streaks while dawn slowly waited somewhere beyond the clouds. Ethan noticed tiny details now that grief normally blurred past him. One cabinet left slightly open beside the sink, flower footprints crossing the marble floor in uneven little paths, a child-sized handprint pressed against the refrigerator door, evidence of life scattered everywhere. The mansion spent years looking perfect. Tonight it finally looked loved. Ava carefully touched the faded photograph beside the recipe card. "She had your eyes." Ethan's throat tightened instantly because Emily did have his eyes. Same shade of gray-blue, same serious expression whenever she focused too hard on something. Claire used to joke that Emily looked like a tiny lawyer preparing courtroom arguments against bedtime rules. Ethan remembered the exact sound of her laughter during thunderstorms because she loved counting seconds between lightning and thunder. He remembered carrying her asleep upstairs after movie nights while her small hand curled around his shirt collar. And suddenly, standing in this ruined kitchen before sunrise beside a little girl covered in flour, Ethan realized something terrifying. He had spent 8 years trying not to remember joy, because joy made the loss unbearable. But forgetting joy slowly erased Emily too. Ava leaned closer toward the photograph and whispered softly, almost like a secret shared only between children. "I think she misses you." Ethan closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Nobody spoke to him this way anymore. Adults approached grief carefully. Therapists used structured language. Friends offered controlled sympathy. Employees avoided emotional conversations completely. But Ava spoke with heartbreaking simplicity. To her, Emily was not a tragedy wrapped in silence. She was simply a little girl whose father still looked sad. The kitchen clock clicked softly toward 4:38 a.m. Somewhere upstairs, the mansion remained asleep, and unaware that its owner stood downstairs beside a half-burnt cake, quietly unraveling emotionally. because a 3-year-old child refused to let grief stay cold forever. Claire Monroe had learned long ago that fear sounded different at 4 in the morning. It sounded like silence where a child should be. The moment she woke and reached toward the empty space beside her bed in the staff quarters, her entire body tightened instantly. Ava always curled against her shoulder during the night after bad dreams, always. But this morning the blanket beside Claire was cold. The room itself felt wrong somehow, too still, too empty. Claire sat upright immediately, her heart beginning to pound hard enough to hurt. "Ava," she whispered at first, still half believing the little girl had wandered into the bathroom. No answer came back. Then Claire noticed the door slightly open. Fear moved through her so quickly, she nearly tripped climbing out of bed. The Walker estate looked enormous before sunrise. Endless hallways, dark polished floors, staircases twisting through shadows. Even after 14 months working there, parts of the mansion still intimidated her at night. Claire hurried down the employee corridor barefoot, panic building faster with every second. Her mind immediately imagined terrible possibilities because mothers living paycheck to paycheck do not have the luxury of assuming things will work out safely. What if Ava wandered outside? What if security found her first? What if she broke something valuable? What if Ethan Walker saw her somewhere she should not be? Then Claire smelled smoke. Not dangerous smoke, burnt sugar smoke. The scent drifted faintly through the downstairs hallway near the kitchen entrance. Claire froze for half a second before rushing faster toward it. And the moment she stepped inside the kitchen doorway, she stopped completely. Flour covered the marble counters like fresh snowfall. Eggshells littered the floor near the sink. One cabinet door hung crookedly open. Melted butter dripped slowly down the side of the counter. Rainbow sprinkles glittered everywhere beneath the warm kitchen lights. And standing in the middle of all that chaos beside her daughter was Ethan Walker. Claire felt the blood drain from her face instantly. Ava stood on the wooden stool wearing pink pajamas streaked with flour, while Ethan remained near the kitchen island holding a faded recipe card in his hands. The billionaire looked strangely still beneath the soft yellow lighting. Not angry exactly, but emotionally distant in a way Claire could not fully understand yet. Ava turned first after hearing her mother gasp softly near the doorway. "Mommy!" Relief flooded Claire so quickly her knees almost weakened. She crossed the kitchen immediately. "Ava, what are you doing?" Her voice came out sharper than intended because terror still shook through her chest. Then she looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, I am so sorry. I woke up and she was gone, and I promise I'll clean everything before anyone else sees this." Ethan did not answer immediately. Claire's stomach twisted painfully. She knew stories about wealthy employers. One complaint, one accident, one mistake involving a child. Suddenly jobs disappeared. Apartments disappeared next. Stability vanished overnight. Claire spent years balancing survival carefully enough to protect Ava from exactly those situations. Losing this position would destroy everything she rebuilt after Chicago, after Daniel left, after overdue bills and eviction notices and sleeping inside her car for 6 terrible weeks during winter. Ava climbed carefully down from the stool before tugging gently on Claire's sweatshirt sleeve. "The cake leaned sideways," she whispered sadly. Claire looked down at the disaster sitting near the oven. The cake truly looked hopeless. One side had collapsed inward completely. Frosting melted unevenly across the top. The candle drooped sideways inside the icing like it had given up surviving. Claire almost wanted to laugh from exhaustion and heartbreak at the same time, because somehow this entire situation felt so perfectly Ava. Trying desperately to create something beautiful, while accidentally setting the kitchen halfway toward disaster instead. "Ava," Claire whispered carefully, "you can't sneak into people's kitchens before sunrise." "I was fixing his birthday." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Of course." Earlier that week, Ava overheard gardeners mentioning October 17th while planting flowers outside near the fountain courtyard. Claire remembered the exact conversation afterward. Ava sat cross-legged inside the employee lounge drawing cakes with crayons while asking innocent questions about birthdays. Claire tried explaining gently that Mr. Walker did not celebrate them anymore. Why? Ava asked. Because somebody he loved died. Ava thought about that answer quietly for nearly a minute before responding with heartbreaking seriousness. Then shouldn't somebody help him feel better? At the time, Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head and changed the subject. Now standing inside Ethan Walker's ruined kitchen before dawn, she realized Ava never let the idea go. Claire lowered her voice immediately. Honey, Mr. Walker doesn't want birthday surprises. But he looked lonely, Ava answered softly. The room became completely still after that. Claire felt embarrassed heat rise instantly into her face. Ava. But Ethan finally spoke. No, he said quietly. Claire looked up carefully. For the first time since entering the kitchen, she truly noticed his expression. Not cold. Not irritated. Not emotionally sealed, shut the way he usually appeared moving through the mansion. He looked wounded. Not freshly wounded either. Like someone carrying grief so long it changed the shape of him permanently. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the crooked little cake again before speaking softer this time. She was trying to do something kind. Claire followed his gaze toward the counter. That was when she noticed the photograph. Emily Walker. Claire recognized the little girl immediately from old newspaper articles stored online beside stories about Ethan's business empire and personal tragedy. But seeing the photograph here inside the kitchen changed something emotionally. Emily looked alive in the picture. Happy. Flower on her cheeks. Smiling beneath an oversized chef hat while holding a whisk nearly bigger than her arm. And suddenly Claire understood why Ethan seemed different tonight. Ava had unknowingly reopened a room inside him. Nobody entered anymore. The little girl suddenly pointed proudly toward the extinguished candle, sitting inside the ruined cake. He made a wish already. Claire blinked in confusion. You lit candles. Ethan nodded once. Just once. But somehow that single movement felt enormous. Because every employee inside the Walker estate knew candles disappeared from this mansion 8 years ago. Birthdays vanished too. Christmas decorations became smaller each year. Celebration itself slowly faded from the property after Emily's death, until the estate started feeling less like a home and more like a museum built around silence. Yet tonight one crooked blue candle burned inside Ethan Walker's kitchen again. Because a 3-year-old girl covered in flour believed sadness should never spend birthdays alone. Outside, rain continued sliding down the tall kitchen windows, while dawn slowly approached somewhere beyond the dark estate grounds. And for the first time in years, the Walker mansion no longer felt emotionally frozen. It felt awake. The kitchen remained quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain sliding down the tall windows overlooking the estate gardens. Claire still stood near the doorway trying to process the impossible scene in front of her. Ethan Walker beside a birthday cake. A candle already burned out. Emily's photograph sitting openly on the counter. None of this fit the version of the man everyone inside the mansion believed they knew. Ava climbed back onto the stool again and reached carefully toward the box of sprinkles like the conversation about grief moments earlier had never happened. Children moved through emotions differently than adults. They could stand beside heartbreak 1 second and become fascinated by frosting the next. It still needs decoration, she whispered seriously. Claire immediately stepped forward. Sweetheart, I think you've done enough decorating for one morning. But Ava shook her head stubbornly, while tiny grains of sugar clung to her curls beneath the kitchen lights. Ethan surprised both of them again. Let her finish. Claire looked at him carefully after hearing those words. He sounded calmer now, not healed, not suddenly transformed, but softer somehow, like something locked tightly inside him had loosened slightly during the past 20 minutes. Ethan moved toward the coffee machine near the counter and paused halfway there. For years his mornings followed identical routines. Black coffee, emails before sunrise, silence. Every day controlled carefully enough to avoid emotional accidents. But now a little girl stood inside his kitchen, turning a ruined cake into a celebration he never planned to survive. Ava suddenly held up a nearly empty bottle of rainbow sprinkles triumphantly. Found them. Then without warning she shook far too hard. Sprinkles exploded everywhere. Across the counter. Across the floor. Across Ethan's dark sweater. Claire covered her eyes briefly. Ava. But Ethan looked down at the bright colors scattered across his sleeve, and something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not politely. Not carefully. A real smile. Small, brief, fragile maybe, but real enough that Claire actually stared for a second. Because nobody inside the Walker estate saw Ethan Walker smile anymore. Ava noticed immediately too, her entire face bright. See, birthdays are working already. Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like laughter again. Claire watched the moment carefully while something shifted inside her chest too. She had spent 14 months working around Ethan, always respectful, always distant. He thanked staff politely, paid generously, never shouted. Yet he carried sadness around him so heavily it changed the atmosphere of rooms after he left them. Even the house itself seemed built around protecting his grief. But tonight the grief looked different. Still there. Still deep. Yet no longer untouchable. Ava carefully pressed another candle into the collapsing frosting while humming softly to herself. Ethan leaned against the counter nearby, watching her tiny hands work with complete seriousness. "Do you always wake up before sunrise to bake cakes for strangers?" he asked quietly. Ava shook her head. "Only sad people." Claire immediately sighed under her breath. "Honey." But Ethan raised one hand gently without taking his eyes off Ava. "It's all right." Then Ava tilted her head thoughtfully. "You're not scary anymore." The sentence hit the room like a dropped glass. Claire looked horrified all over again. Ava Monroe. But Ethan actually blinked in surprise instead of anger. "I was scary before," Ava nodded honestly. "A little." She pointed toward the tall, dark hallway leading deeper into the mansion. "This whole house feels like somebody forgot to hug it." Silence. Complete silence. Because somehow a 3-year-old child had described the Walker estate more accurately than therapists, journalists, or business partners ever could. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. "Forgot to hug it." The words wrapped around something broken deep inside him. He suddenly remembered the final birthday Emily celebrated in this kitchen. Purple balloons taped badly against cabinet doors because she insisted she could decorate herself. Vanilla frosting on her nose. Tiny bare feet running across marble floors while music played softly through the house. The mansion used to feel warm then. Loud. Alive. After the accident, Ethan removed every trace of celebration because joy became dangerous. But over time, he had unknowingly removed life itself too. Ava pointed suddenly toward the photograph again. "Did Emily sing birthday songs loud?" Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "The loudest." "What was her favorite?" For a second, Ethan almost could not speak at all. Because he remembered it instantly. Emily loved singing even when she forgot lyrics halfway through songs. She would replace missing words with nonsense and keep going confidently anyway. Sometimes she danced around the kitchen holding mixing spoons like microphones while Claire, Ethan's late wife, laughed from the dining room doorway. Claire. Even thinking her name still hurt. Most people focused only on Emily's death publicly because children made tragedies feel sharper in headlines. But Ethan lost both his daughter and marriage in pieces afterward. Claire Walker survived the accident physically, but emotionally disappeared slowly beneath grief. They could not survive together. Within 2 years, she moved to California after endless therapy sessions and sleepless nights neither of them knew how to fix. Their divorce happened quietly, respectfully, but heartbreak layered itself over heartbreak until Ethan eventually stopped trying to feel anything at all. Ava's tiny voice pulled him back into the kitchen. "Mr. Ethan." He blinked slowly. "Sorry." "What was the song?" Ethan stared toward the rain outside the windows, while memories returned warm and painful together. Then quietly, almost embarrassed by the sound of it, he answered, "You are my sunshine." Emily sang it constantly. Ava smiled instantly. Then before anyone could stop her, the little girl began singing softly beneath the kitchen lights. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Her tiny voice drifted gently through the enormous mansion, and Ethan Walker felt his heart break open all over again. Ava's tiny voice floated softly through the kitchen, while rain continued tracing silver lines down the mansion windows. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The words were slightly off-key, a little uneven, but heartbreakingly gentle. Ethan stood completely still beside the counter while something inside him unraveled all over again. Emily used to sing the exact same way, loud at first, then quieter whenever she forgot the next line. Sometimes she changed the words entirely and laughed afterward like mistakes were part of the music itself. Ethan had not heard that song inside this house since the year of the accident. After Emily died, silence took over everything gradually. The piano downstairs remained closed. Movie nights disappeared. The kitchen stopped smelling like vanilla after dark. Even laughter started sounding out of place inside the Walker estate. Yet now a 3-year-old little girl covered in flour stood beside a collapsing birthday cake, singing warmth back into the mansion, one fragile note at a time. Claire quietly leaned against the edge of the counter watching Ethan carefully. She saw the exact moment his eyes filled with tears again. Not dramatic tears, not the kind people perform publicly. These looked older, exhausted, like grief finally growing too heavy to carry silently anymore. Ava kept singing softly while trying to relight the crooked blue candle using both hands around the lighter exactly the way adults had shown her before. After 3 failed attempts, the flame finally appeared again. "There," she whispered proudly. The candle flickered gently between them. Ethan stared at it for several seconds without speaking. Then Ava climbed carefully down from the stool and walked closer until she stood directly beside him. Her tiny fingers tugged lightly against the sleeve of his sweater. "You can still love birthdays even if someone's missing," she said softly. The sentence landed deep inside him. Because for 8 years Ethan believed protecting himself meant refusing joy entirely. No birthdays, no decorations, no music echoing through hallways. He convinced himself grief deserved silence. But standing here tonight beside a child who barely understood death yet somehow understood loneliness perfectly, Ethan realized something painful. Emily never would have wanted this house to become emotionally empty. She would have hated it. Ava pointed toward the candle again. "You didn't finish your wish earlier." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the tiny blue flame bending sideways above the ruined frosting. Claire almost interrupted, almost told Ava to stop pushing. But something about the moment felt too delicate to touch. Ethan finally leaned forward slowly. And this time when he closed his eyes, the wish came immediately. Not for money, not for success, not even for the pain to disappear. He wished for the courage to remember Emily without destroying himself. Then he blew out the candle. Thin smoke curled upward between them while the kitchen fell silent again. Ava smiled proudly like she sensed something important had just happened. Outside, dawn finally began stretching pale gold across the estate gardens. Rain slowed into a soft mist drifting above the fountain courtyard. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, Morning staff would begin waking soon. Coffee machines downstairs would hum alive. Deliveries would arrive at the front gate. The world would continue moving exactly as it always had. But inside the kitchen, something had changed permanently. Claire noticed it too. The room no longer felt cold. Not because of temperature, because of presence. Life sat here again. Warm life. Ava suddenly yawned so hard she nearly lost balance beside the counter. Claire laughed softly under her breath before quickly covering her mouth, almost surprised by the sound herself. Ethan looked toward them both carefully. Claire's exhausted eyes, Ava's frosting-covered pajamas, flowers still scattered across marble floors like evidence of emotional trespassing. For years he believed loneliness protected him from further pain. Yet tonight these two people accidentally walked through walls nobody else dared approach. Claire gently brushed sugar from Ava's curls. "We should probably clean this before the rest of the staff sees it." Ethan glanced around the kitchen again. The ruined cake. The open cabinets. The handprints across the counter. The photograph of Emily resting openly beside the recipe card. "No," he said quietly. Claire looked confused. "Sir, leave it for now." Because for the first time in nearly a decade, the mess no longer looked like damage. It looked like memory. Ava suddenly lifted both arms toward Ethan without hesitation, the universal signal children use when asking to be carried. Claire immediately started apologizing. "Ava, no, honey." But Ethan surprised everyone again. He picked her up. Carefully, almost uncertainly. Ava rested her sleepy head against his shoulder instantly like she trusted him completely. Ethan froze for a second after feeling the small weight of her settle against him. Memories hit hard again. Emily falling asleep after movie nights. Tiny arms wrapped around his neck while carrying her upstairs. The smell of strawberry shampoo in her hair. For a moment grief returned so sharply he thought it might crush him. But something else existed beside it now too. Warmth. Ava blinked sleepily against his shoulder, before whispering one final sentence barely above a breath. "Your house doesn't feel lonely anymore." Ethan looked around the kitchen slowly, while dawn light spilled across the marble counters. And for the first time in 8 years, she was right. The sun had fully risen by the time the kitchen finally grew quiet again. Morning light poured through the tall windows in soft golden streams, catching tiny particles of flour still floating through the air like drifting snow. The ruined birthday cake remained sitting crookedly in the center of the counter beside Emily's faded recipe card. One blue candle leaned sideways inside hardened frosting. Sprinkles covered the marble floors. Tiny handprints still marked cabinet doors near the sink. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan Walker did not want any of it cleaned away. Ava had fallen asleep against his shoulder sometime after sunrise. Her small hand still rested loosely against the front of his sweater, while Claire quietly gathered bowls near the sink. But even she moved slower now, almost careful not to disturb whatever had settled inside the mansion overnight. Peace. Not complete peace. Not healing. Grief does not disappear in one morning. But something softer. Something human. Ethan looked toward Emily's photograph again. For years he avoided looking directly at pictures of his daughter because every memory felt like reopening an old wound with bare hands. Yet now the photograph no longer looked trapped inside tragedy. Emily looked alive again. Messy. Joyful. Covered in flour beneath an oversized chef hat while smiling at whoever stood behind the camera. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled back. Claire finally broke the silence softly. She would have loved Ava. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before nodding slowly. She would have adored her. The words nearly cracked in the middle. Outside, gardeners began working near the fountain courtyard. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, Staff members started their routines completely unaware that something extraordinary had happened before dawn. They did not know Ethan Walker laughed in his kitchen again. They did not know a little girl carrying flower-covered kindness somehow reopened a part of him grief had locked away for years. But the mansion knew. Houses remember things. And this one finally remembered warmth. Ava stirred sleepily against Ethan's shoulder before whispering one final sentence without fully opening her eyes. "Next year we can make the cake prettier." Ethan looked down at her tiny, exhausted face and quietly answered something he never imagined himself saying again. "Yeah," he whispered softly, "next year." And somewhere deep inside the silence he carried for 8 long years. That became the moment Ethan Walker finally started living again. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If this touched your heart in any way, let us know in the comments what part moved you the most. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional story like this one. We'd also love to know where you're watching from tonight. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of the people who still need your warmth before it's too late.